This is Dr. J, and you are watching week 11 for the course Introduction to Anthropology. This week we'll be talking about media and the concept of the cyborg or the human computer interface. Thinking about the future, thinking about the directions that technology will take us as a society, and also thinking about some of the both positive and negative social effects that might be produced. We started off the course looking at the 400,000 year history of anatomically modern humans, and now we are in the present, going into the future, thinking about imagination, thinking about different ways that individuals might foresee our society advancing. If you look on the screen, I got three cyborg individuals up in the upper left hand corner. There's Cyborg from the DC universe. I believe he was a college athlete, a very fictional character, of course, a college athlete that lost some limbs, and he got this ever changing and morphing suit that he could use to combat villains. We got Daft Punk here on the top right. They are a techno electronic music act from the 1990s, 2000s. They're still very active, but I think that was probably their pinnacle of success. And they had this sort of cyborg aesthetic. They're French, they didn't want people to see their faces, and so they would always be wearing these very elaborate, futuristic looking suits. And then their music would also be sort of futuristic going along with that. And then on the bottom left hand side, you got Robocop. This is sort of this dystopian rather than utopian. You have the opposite. You have the dystopian, where like everything in the future is bad. You have this dystopian future in Detroit depicted in the 1980s, where everything is getting privatized and a corporate entity just comes in and privatizes the police force of Detroit, and they want these very mechanical, analytical police officers. So they take a dead police officer and they put him in the body of this robot. It's like Pulp Fiction. It's very bloody, very gory, really interesting cult classic. But these are just three examples of how the cyborg has sort of embedded in our contemporary cultural and social imaginations. There's countless other examples. Some central themes we can think about that are a little bit more anthropological. We can look at the idea of representation, how we present our ideas, the symbols and the artifacts that we use to reflect our social goals. You can think of the idea of power, how hierarchy and social structure are in this conforming structure around propaganda, how power and authority require media representation, they require technology, they require artificial goods, they require artifacts in order to exist. Then we can also think about the modern world. What does it mean to be modern? What does it mean to have these technological comforts? These are all themes that we'll be seeing throughout the remainder of the course as well. And we can look here on the image on the screen. This is just a family sitting around a television in the 1960s. I remember doing this a lot every day growing up, and then the internet happened and people stopped sitting around a television altogether. So we can just think about one specific technology and the incredible impact that it might have on our everyday social environments. I did a lot of my research in this favela or shantytown called the Complexo do Alemão, or the German complex. This is an image that I took from the patio where I stayed. You might be able to see some pretty significant cultural artifacts here. You have a cable car system, a gondola system. They have these throughout ski country in Colorado or out in Vermont. You'll see these gondolas everywhere you go. They started building them in shanty towns or favelas in Brazil as a dual purpose tourist attraction and logistical workaround. You can notice on the screen here, there's not many roads Going up to the top of the hill, this is a community with about 100,000 people. You're probably looking at about 5,000 homes right now, multiple stories, cinder block. There's some thoroughfares through here that are so small they're sort of hidden. People can take motorcycles through. There might be one main road on each hill, and there's about 7 hills in the complex dual amount. And so those main roads, they can support some cars and maybe a garbage truck. This community was built informally over the course of 70,000 years, or 70 years, excuse me, 70 years, not 70,000 years, 70 years. And so what you'll see is really imperfect, unsanctioned types of infrastructure. People stealing electrical service from the main grid, people tapping into the water supplies, people throwing waste in random places, people building not to code and building unsafe passageways without proper fire escapes and all that kind of stuff. So just in this very basic description, I didn't even get into the daily living in this community and the complex dual amount. But you can imagine that just with all of those sort of physical and technological constraints that I talked about, from access to water or electricity or transportation, how those can have very dramatic effects on a broader society. This is not even talking about the forms of poverty and the forms of violence that exist in these types of communities, which is a whole nother thing we may speak about here a little bit later in the section. But nonetheless, imagine you spend 4 years here looking specifically at technology, modern technology, how it embeds in everyday life. And that's more or less what I did. I was often stuck on this balcony. It's hard to get around. There was a lot of gunfights between drug dealers and police officers during the 4 years that I lived there. And so I was often stuck on this balcony using social media as a type of entryway into the culture of the community. So I made a lot of friends on the community. I started following the main political leaders and activists, and there was many very famous people. And my favela society, even though I was in the community, was very much defined by this digital medium that was being created and developed in the 2000s. So something that's very specific to being a modern favela is to have this sort of digital infrastructure, this influencer infrastructure that is now so commonplace. Some of the people that I studied with in the complex dual amount were photographers. This was in the lead up to the 2016 Rio Olympics. It was a big deal for Brazil. It was the third major sporting event that took over the country in the process of 8 years. So there's a lot of different types of public infrastructure being developed, a lot of different social programs being advertised and aligned with the arrival of the Olympics. Got a lot of journalists, you got a lot of NGOs, non-government organizations, you got a lot of corporations coming in that are trying to put their stamp on Rio de Janeiro right before all the cameras come in. And then you also have a government that is really fearful that there is going to be a wave of violence just as the world starts looking at their cities. So they went to the people in the favela and they said, we're going to come in and we're going to remove your drug gangs. We're going to have weekly meetings with you to help communicate with the society in the favela and the broader dominant society. And then we're also going to help encourage outsiders to sponsor social programs. So that would include not only health programs and educational programs, but also just broader social inclusion programs. Where do we see some form of inequality? And one of the big ones that I latched onto at that time, and this was sort of the era of pacification, they would call it pacification. We're going to send in the police and install social programs. We're going to retake the favela and we're going to turn it into a socially included, utopic like community. And this is all going to be done using smarter policing, computerized policing, different types of data collection, the best analytical, criminologically grounded types of strategies possible. And then we're also going to do that with generationally transformative social inclusion. And one of the groups that I was really interested in were these favela photographers. So in the Complex do Alemão, there was a group of teenagers and young adults, probably I would say between 17 and 25. And I was closer to that age at that time. And so I would go and I'd hang out at their events and I'd befriend them. And over the course of 4 years, this was one of the main groups that I was really interested in as an ethnographer. And here you have Renato. At the time, I think he was 18. He was one of the younger guys that were around. And his brother, René, he was becoming this superstar in Brazil. And nowadays, his brother, René, is advising the president of Brazil on favela policy, for example. But they all started, both René and the guy on the camera here on the screen, Renato, they both started working in these non-governmental programs, these sort of social inclusion programs. And as the Olympics became closer, both René and Renato and a bunch of other different photographers in the favela were getting a lot more spotlight than before. And they were sort of seen as the new generation of entrepreneurs and journalists and social thinkers in Brazil. And so this, you can see on this image, this is sort of this kind of stuff that they would capture. So someone came into the favela, I believe it was Petrobras, the largest company in Brazil. It's a petroleum company. They came in and they bought like 10 cameras for a group of these really ambitious, well-known youth artists and activists. And they said, hey, this is how you use a camera. Go take pictures. We're going to support you. And we're going to give you a forum for a 6-month period. And then hopefully it'll change your world. And it actually did. Most of the people that participated in this program ended up going and working in activism, working in politics, or working in journalism. And now, as they are in their 30s, you can just see their whole careers have developed. And here you see Renato taking a picture of police, and that was pretty transformative for the time. You didn't get images of the police working in the favela, and you particularly didn't get them created by people from the favela straight to the presses. Social media was also very important. Instagram and Twitter made all of these images very accessible. So pacification is this policing technology, this policing strategy or tactic, and more or less it is a idea of community policing, so going and being more engaged with activists and community leaders, of smart policing, of using digital technology and smart media centers with a bunch of cameras and monitoring social media and developing a citizen informant network that can work anonymously and safely for everybody. And then also trying to develop economically. So there was this process you can imagine, very similar as if the United States would go and invade Iraq or invade Afghanistan. The Brazilian government was trying to do the exact same thing in the favela. And there's these huge generational drug gangs that are incredibly violent. There was this 45-day period during the process of pacification in the favela while I was living there, where over 100 people were killed. This is actually a meeting after one of the last deaths in this 45-day period. There was a 10-year-old boy named Rinaldo who was killed after using his cell phone on his door stoop because there was so much violence in the community. He was forced to stay home from school, and it was over Easter weekend. He was just hanging out. A police patrol came around a very blind alleyway and within the matter of seconds shot Eduardo, the 10-year-old, playing on his cell phone. And the community came out and rioted. They got tear gassed. There was eventually a 5,000 person protest that encircled the community and demanded that the pacification process was over. But once again, we can see the importance of technology in describing this context. And unfortunately, I'm just thinking I saw news of it. Well, it was almost immediately. There was a shootout, and then almost immediately I saw on social media that this young boy, Eduardo, they named him, and it was instantly clear that I knew him, and I most likely heard the shots that were the ones that killed him, even though there was shooting all day, every day. So I probably didn't hear, one shot and then I heard that this guy died, but rather I was just so accustomed to these shots that it just sort of bled into the background. And it was just sort of a very, very intimate experience for everyone who lived in the community. We all learned about it through online forums, and then we also organized online and participated. And I say I was very much active in trying to document, participate, and support my friends in the favela at this time. And so here you see is a photographer up here in the middle left of the screen. That's Bebeto. He's one of those young photographers that I talked about. He's now working for Reuters and Associated Press, so he's got a gig with two of the best news organizations in the world. There is some political candidates that are sitting at the table, and then you have the general who is in charge of pacification in the Complex do Alemão, and he is saying, more or less at this moment, we too are the victims, meaning the police too are the victims, we too are dying, and we too suffer. And it elicited a chorus of boos from the 1,000 people that were sitting in this high school gymnasium that had been closed down for weeks because of shootouts. Once again, thinking about how technology and how different types of new forms of information and new forms of information gathering and presenting the world all sort of mixed together in this very human and mortal way. The Olympics were a significant event. You can think all the cameras that were going to be on the community. And then you also had a president named Lula that had been out of office, but his successor had been elected, Dilma, and then she was also going through her own impeachment process. And they more or less, in the run-up to the Olympics, you had this wave of violence, and then you also had this government movement that was trying to defund all these development projects and just try to really hollow out all of these efforts to go and develop poor communities. Regardless of the programs being violent, there was obviously this impetus, this desire to include favela people into the broader Brazilian society, both economically and socially. And so there's this sort of push and pull in the politics of Brazil at the time. So all of this technological aspect of organizing on Twitter and on social media and being empowered by digital technology and all those types of things are all being defined by these broader political moments that seem very abstract and disconnected from the everyday lives that we live. And this image here was taken during a protest with 5,000 people that I mentioned on the previous slide. You see just from left to right, you see a police officer who's there to protect the protesters, even though the protests are against the police. I always found that to be very sort of hypocritical. You can see that the police officer also has a hand on his gun in the middle of a peaceful protest that is against police violence. He's looking directly at me in my camera. And then you also have, just to the right of the police officer, a set of cameramen, both one Beijinho and one an older gentleman who had been working in photography in Brazil for the last 50 years, sort of a mentor for a lot of these younger guys, were at the protest shooting images. And then, of course, you have a protester holding a sign up in demanding something of retribution for the death of the young boy Eduardo. Another image from the same protest here on the screen. It's not necessarily 100% clear in this image, but you can see that the police officer is posing for the camera, and there is two police officers just to the right, One's sort of obscured by the cameraman, Becino, but they're laughing because the one officer is posing comically, according to them. So, just something to think about the general context and the media representation that was at play, knowing the officer might show up on a router's news feed or something like that. He was very much interested in looking his best. In the favela, this is a pretty big social transition from previous generations where there had been more or less a ubiquitous everyday dominance of the drug gang and an absence of any state or democratic authority. The drug gang was democratic in its own right, not that it was elected or anything like that, but it was made up of people from the community, and it often acted to resolve social conflicts in the community that the government might not be able to do, such as my neighbor owing me money, or in this informally built community, my neighbor built a little too close to my wall and I need to get this sort of resolved because it's causing me problems. You could go to the drug gang and do that, but you weren't allowed to do anything like complain about the drug gang or go and challenge the drug gang or inform on the drug gang for obvious reasons. It would completely dismantle their power and authority. Similarly, if you were to take a photograph of the open air drug markets that exist, so you can walk down the street in the favela when police aren't around and you'll see people with picnic tables full of individually packaged cocaine and marijuana, and of course other drugs like LSD and some more particular cocktails that exist only in Brazil. And you can go and just buy it and you can put down money. They normally have a group of drug dealers sort of hanging out non-aggressively. Anytime I go past them, they're sort of in the middle of the street. Anytime I go past them, they very politely call me sir because I'm like a 40-year-old man. So they treat me with this like ultimate form of respect. They're caretakers in the neighborhood for a great part. And many of them are younger people that have been taught to respect their elders. Nonetheless, though, if I would go and take pictures of them without permission and share them, there could be a good chance that they might threaten my life or kill me. And even in the Complexo do Alemão, there is a very famous story of a guy using an undercover camera in the early 2000s to record a drug deal on the main street so everybody could see it. It's just not supposed to be photographed. Put it on national television, and a few months later, he was found doing another investigative report by a group of drug dealers. They killed him in something called a microonda or microwave. So they would cut off his limbs with a katana blade and put him in a stack of tires and burn him alive. So this law of silence is pretty important. So even though the police came and caused all this violence, what it did was open up this social and cultural opportunity for these young people to document oppression, for them to, for the first time, look at the most oppressive people in the community, who are now the police officers rather than the drug dealers, and turn the cameras on them and say, hey, these are the damages that you are causing society. So technology, social media, digital photography is all facilitating this broader process of liberating individuals in the favela from the yoke of the law of silence. You can also see the resignification of death in the digital age. If you look here on the screen, it says, "Não matam nossos filhos," don't kill our children. This was at the headquarters of the Pacification Police Force, the UPP, the Unit of Pacification Police, and they trained just outside of the Complexo do Alemão, and they sent police officers to 40 different favelas. Of the 400 favelas that are across Rio, they had broad jurisdiction, and they normally sent their newest trained officers to the Complexo do Alemão to do training runs, and this would often become deadly, not only from rookies shooting their own officers in the back to people being too trigger happy and accidentally killing children. And so this was one of many protests that went to the headquarters, and they just put up these signs and they painted the concrete in front of it. But something that got me thinking, I was stuck at home, I was going to these protests, and during the digital age, there is this reproduction of violent videos. And in order to develop this type of critical activist mass, you have to repeat and share and reproduce the images that inspire. So anytime there is a clear image of police abuse that can be shared on the internet, it normally is shared, and normally there is a type of response from authority, whether it's firing or punishing the officer or rallying around the officer and claiming that they were justified. And that's often what happened in the complex de Lemão. And through the repetition of those violent images, those deadly images that now exist on the internet, we see a type of critical mass, sort of a snowball rolling down a hill, accumulating this important cultural significance. Reproduction, rather than the singularity of death, now makes it more important. Something to think about how this very basic human condition, such as life and death, could be resignified and changed, even slightly, by the use of new technology. What is the anthropology of media? Pulling away from that very specific example, we can see the social roles and systems that surround the production of mass culture. We have these nation states. We have these collectives of individuals, of 300 million people, of 1 billion people, that all have the same national identity, that all are on the same page when it comes to language and cultural values and economic values to some extent. Of course, there's going to be division within any society that large, but how can we see anthropology as a way to understand the mass representations of our society and our culture? General question we can think about for the remainder of the lecture today. There's a movie, if we look at the history of documentary filmmaking, so I talked a little bit about this with the favela photographer, the role of the camera. There's a really good movie. I'll suggest that you watch it. It's a recommended watch. I would definitely recommend watching like 5 minutes of it just to sort of get a feel of it. But it's called Man with a Movie Camera. It's by a director named Vertov, and it was filmed in 1929. This is possibly the first documentary film. It was made in the Soviet Union. They wanted to have a socialist form of media that contrasted with the capitalist form of media that was dominant in the United States. And they produced a number of really interesting socialist form directors. One was Vertov, who went and took his camera around. And part of industrial socialism is seeing that the man and the machine, those who work the means of production, are also the owners of the means of production. Those who are working the factory line are also owning the factory. Those who are working the camera are also the ones who are presented by the camera. And so what was really revolutionary about Man with a Movie Camera is that you had some of the first-person shots. Hollywood and many other type of film industries across the globe would often reproduce the stage, or they would simply be recording things for a news report, but they weren't actually using their camera as an active extension of the human being to document a broader story or to elicit a more complex type of human condition. So Man with a Movie Camera, really interesting. He's going around this Soviet city as it's industrializing. It's more or less just a day in the life of this socialist city. It's very modern. The camera is moving in all these really unique ways that aren't necessarily just like what we see in these stage plays that are being recorded in Hollywood, but rather they're out there in the real world and they're looking at real world conditions. This is one image that you can see. You can also see a superimposition of a needle and thread over a person. This was just a really beautiful, interesting shot that associated the human being with a type of technology that they used. And this took place in a clothing factory. So this sewing person was someone who was intimately connected. Their identity was intimately connected to the machine that they were using. So what can we see just as a broader theme from Man with a Movie Camera? We can see the idea that technology requires culture to make sense. And then we can also see the idea of the kino eye, or the eye that is created with the camera, how representation becomes an extension of the human condition. And here we have an image of Vertov taking a selfie, thinking about how important selfies are nowadays in the age of social media. 150 years ago, the selfie did not exist. Technological systems are not isolated, but they work in a broader mass. So if we just look at Man with a Movie Camera, it's a camera that's documenting a larger industry that also needs to produce other types of machines, such as projectors and movie houses and screens. And so just one singular camera can't work without a larger system as a backup to help sort of produce the final end game of that technology. An individual technology becomes workable only when it is one part of a larger system. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when we use